Alex has already introduced myself to you, but I wanted to share a little bit more about my engagement in well-being and resilience, which has really taken shape and rooted back to my background in training. Prior to becoming a pharmacist, I was a dietitian. So serving as a registered dietitian, went into pharmacy, and have come full circle in pursuing a board certification in health and wellness, as well as my background and training as a yoga practitioner. So well-being and resilience is very dear to my heart. And I am so blessed to have the opportunity to work with our staff, our faculty, our residents and students through numerous ways, whether that's through elective offerings or co-curricular offerings. Working right now to develop a curriculum on the medical campus for all the 7 schools of medicine or medicine-related fields around well-being and resilience. So again, it's definitely a heart area for me, and I'm so fortunate to be able to be here and share that with you. Let's see, I have no disclosures to share. I wanted to sort of check in. I have the chat box up, and I'll try and be peeking in that. And I'd just like to know right now if you would do me the honor of putting in the chat, hopefully you can access that, how you're feeling right now. So thinking about, I'm already introducing this concept to you about a car, but if you were to look at your kind of dashboard and your gauge, where's your energy at? Would you put yourself as depleted, good, or energized? So seeing some goods and some depleteds, which I think is completely natural given where we've been of late. Oh, I like the quarter tank. So not quite above the depleted, headed towards the good. So I'll be checking in, and you can please continue to submit into the chat, but I'll be checking back in with you on this later as well. So as I alluded to, this is a 5-part series. We're beginning today looking at a general framework for well-being, which is rooted in positive psychology. I'm not sure how many joining today are familiar with all of the research around positive psychology. In particular, one individual who's considered one of the godfathers of positive psychology is Dr. Martin Seligman. And he has created an approach or a framework consideration around well-being to follow what he calls the PERMA approach. And I'm using that to actually provide structure to this entire series. So I'll be covering that in with you in just a moment or two, but we'll begin with the P today in PERMA. And we're not going to go in the exact order of this framework. I've shifted things around a little bit, but each element will be covered during this 5-part series. So first, starting today with positive emotions. Webinar 2 will focus on relationships and the human dimension, which is so critical for all of us. The third will center on meaning and purpose. Then we'll move over to goals and accomplishments. And then finally around engagement and considering our work life. So I'm not sure how many of you had the opportunity to access the energy quiz, which was provided to you after you registered for this webinar. So I'll be asking you a question about that in a minute. But before I do, I wanted to have another pause opportunity and have you think about, as we are checking under the hood with this inventory you've perhaps had a chance to do, what is your dream car? Like, what would be your dream car? Do you perhaps have that dream car? What would that be for you? Just throw it in the chat. You know, maybe you've been so fortunate to have it, or it's still something you might think about from time to time. Maybe you're a car collector. What would be your dream car? Oh yeah. There's some ones in there that are definitely our dream cars. Are there others? Oh yeah. The Lamborghini or Porsche, F-250. Any hybrids or others that come to mind? Oh, very neat. Yeah, a VW wagon. Never goes out of style. So if you feel like continuing to share, please do so as I proceed. So if you had the chance to do it, and no worries if you didn't, that's still available to you to do after the seminar today. You would have received or seen a way to sort of sift through, depending on how many things you checked off, where your findings might have landed you. So maybe you're excellent, you've got excellent energy management skills. Maybe it was more reasonable, or significant deficits might have been discovered or uncovered, or a full-fledged energy management crisis. So any thoughts about where some of you might have landed, any kind of revelation or epiphany? You're welcome to comment again in the chat. So if you so wish to share, you're welcome to, but I do have a question for you. So in terms of your energy areas, and thinking about some possible targets that you may want to aim for in terms of experimenting ways to strengthen or improve your energy, if you would, in the chat, share with me, as it broke out into these sort of categories, body, mind, emotion, spirit. Did you find yourself high with a number of check marks in one particular area? If yes, maybe put that in the chat. Or were you spread around where you had some areas that need some energy boosting in more than one domain? So body, spread around, see that more than once already. So body and mind needing some boosting, emotions good, wonderful. So something to keep in mind as we move forward today being our emphasis on positive emotions. And as continued through this webinar series, which I hope you'll be able to join for, that you'll be able to pull some nuggets and glean some strategies that you might be able to put into practice or experiment with to help you in your energy center. So I'd love to begin or continue the journey with two of my favorite quotes. The first comes from Viktor Frankl, who I'm sure many of you are all familiar with, who is an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, philosopher, author, and a Holocaust survivor. And his story is a true testament to the power of forgiveness and for self-compassion, which are two ripple effects associated with positive psychology. I'll be mentioning those again. And his quote is, "Everything can be taken from man, but the last of human freedoms, to choose one attitudes in any set of given circumstance." And then the second, which I think sets the stage well for our journey today and onward, is to have hope one doesn't need certainty, only possibility. And this comes from Howard Zinn, who again, he's also a well-known American historian, playwright, philosopher, and a socialist thinker. So I'd love for you to consider me your coach concierge, kind of your guide on the side throughout this webinar series to give you your license for change. So if you, again, think about the idea of you being maybe an autonomous car, this dream car of yours, and checking under the hood as to your needs, these dimensions of well-being that I'll be stressing again in just a few moments. You know, how might you be caring for your car? When you think about the exterior, the vessel of your car, you know, preserving the paint and the quality of the outside, but also the inside of the car, the interior, the vessel inside of us, and the importance of preserving that as well for quality of life. So I think it's important for us to just pause and talk a little bit about stress. We face this day to day and have been under a significant additive amount of stress due to the pandemic for over a year now. So I would just like to talk a moment about the perception of stress, and that there are two main dimensions of stress. There's good stress or eustress, and I'll come back to that. And then there can be distress, and we might consider that bad stress, even though I don't like to label stress as good or bad, and you'll understand that in just a moment. So in general, good stress can be short-term and pushes us to accomplish greater things. In these situations, we tend to have a lot of control over the outcome, and the stress can actually motivate us. So maybe you think about when you were earning a degree, when you passed a board exam, getting married, or having your first child. Also, too little stress can leave us not able to necessarily reach our goals. We can feel disengaged or bored. We lose our motivation. But it is important to note that for some of us, things that seem to be a source of good stress, which is why I mentioned this before, those examples I mentioned can actually lead to bad stress. It can tip us over and be a source of distress. And part of our response to stress relates to our individual genetics, our past history, our environment support, our coping skills, and our attitude. So what you can also see from this image is that over time, with repeated stress or significant stress, our hormones like cortisol will definitely rise. And if sustained to be elevated, we might tip over into more of this danger zone or this red zone around exhaustion, moral distress, or worse yet, suffer from symptoms of burnout, anxiety, or depression. There's also manifestations that occur due to stress in our bodies. So this picture sort of represents this anxiety loop and how we respond in our minds to a perceived threat through our emotions, our behaviors, and the physiological manifestations that I was referring to. So when we think about what happens in the body, the mind, through your emotions and through your behaviors. So our goal here would be to draw from our well of coping skills and strategies to help calm the mind and body and sort of retrain our response to a perceived threat. So in situations that we might catastrophize or think the worst in our mind, can we create space between a stimulus and a response to change the outcome? So we have been facing, as I alluded to before, unprecedented times, having fear and anxiety about infection rates, our family members, our vulnerable populations, and this fear of working in healthcare if you're worried about your own health or the health of someone in your home. Many of us had to work remotely, using technologies perhaps that were originally outside of our comfort zone. We've been missing physical connections with our families, friends, and colleagues. And our world at times has been feeling foreign. Sometimes the news reports are not the most pleasant news, and we might be struggling about how to build more contingency planning. So having a pandemic, not unlike other life events, as you're seeing depicted here, whether it's some other illness of yourself or a loved one, maybe a car accident, which can also be quite catastrophic and life-altering. All of these things can cause true spikes in our stress and in our lives in general. And that might leave us at times waking up in like a fog or feeling overwhelmed or having disruptions in our sleep, our appetite, our family life. So our resilience, our ability to rise above these stresses and difficulties in life might be the biggest challenge that we all face. The work of Amy Cuddy and I always get this name, Wellsberg, has told us or shown us that we have been moving through some natural course of the phases of a psychological crisis. This I'm speaking particularly around the pandemic. And that typically has three phases. An emergency phase where we sort of rise to the occasion. So when you think back to when the pandemic first hit its peak and became that life-altering experience, how teams and individuals were able to show up, rise up, and perform. So maybe productivity actually peaking here. And then we've been spending quite a long time in this regression phase. in the level of uncertainty, feeling a sense or loss of purpose, feeling anxiety, paralysis, or fatigue associated with that, and perhaps being less productive or withdrawn. And moving into this recovery phase. So trying to find our new norms and what life will be like now that things are starting to open up, and determining what might come next. So that brings me to an important element around resilience. And I think about it in two dimensions. One is related to the skills, knowing that for some of us, these skills might be innate, but for others, these can be grown. And the second aspect, so one's skill related, and the other is your appraisal process. So how we react to life stressors, to those challenges in life. So these are not an exhaustive list, but certainly ones that stand out to me as skill elements that again can be developed. And part of that relates to things like our flexibility, being able to have self-agency or self-confidence, finding meaning and purpose, which can evolve with us over time in life, being able to see the big picture, finding humor, I would add that in as well, our problem-solving skills, being able to manage our emotions, which we're going to be talking more about today in the remainder of the webinar. But also depicted here is, again, thinking about life adversities and difficulties, and when that happens and that strikes, how do we react? How do we respond? Do we come back to a status quo? Hopefully you see my mouse here. Or do we hit down to a more of a survival level? And with repeated impacts or the level of significance rising around a difficulty, what can happen, which is detrimental, is we fall into a dysfunctional level. When what we really want to do, and what the positive psychology research tells us, is the importance of not just bouncing back, but thriving. So rising above the challenge, despite the challenge, and coming out not to status quo, but thriving despite it. That is true resilience. So that brings me to this, coming to this concept around the importance of a maintenance plan for your car or for you. And so thinking about this, even prior to the pandemic, unfortunately, the national statistics regarding healthy practices was not glowing, even in regards to our emotional stability and our work engagement. 95% of us were not engaged with the top 3 to 5 healthy behaviors. 65% overweight or obese. 68% not being engaged at work. And overall, 80% of adults not thriving. So clearly, having a maintenance plan for you, your dream car, is critical to maintaining our well-being and resilience. So as I mentioned today, our focus is really around sort of unpacking and talking about the power of positive emotions. And then I'll continue working through the PERMA model, which each of the successional webinars. So first is positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning or purpose, or I like to call your why, accomplishments, and then kind of cross-cutting to all of these is a focus on our health, of course. So if you think about being on the journey or the highway of life, today I'm going to touch on these remaining elements: gratitude, forgiveness, and the power of empathy. Many of you might be familiar with this, our hierarchy of needs, and how critical it is that we meet this lower level of the triangle to be met before we move up. So basic needs first, then our psychological needs, and our needs for self-fulfillment. And tandem to this is the importance of our 3 essential human needs. You may have seen these described perhaps a little bit differently, but I like to think about them as our independence or your autonomy, and how these are linked to our happiness in life, our relatedness or connectedness, which speaks to the importance of human dimension and human connection, how critical that is for us. And then competence or mastery. So you may have seen this more as mastery, but this is why people in life might choose to pursue other interests It may be directing us to certain hobbies or picking up an instrument that maybe we've always had a thought or desire to do. Part of that is personal pursuit of mastery. And we also know this is very vital for us in the workplace, professionally having autonomy and mastery. So the Stanford Research Center has done quite a bit of research around what really matters to us as it relates to well-being. And they studied more than 30,000 individuals to sort of identify what would be a top 10. Number one in importance is to the extent people felt well integrated into the social fabric of their community. So social connection, which may surprise you perhaps, is number one of importance. Relationships offer us support, comfort, and belonging. These are all important human needs. And alternatively, on the opposite side, many of you may know this from living through challenges in life, but when a loved one or an important person in your network is not doing well, that has a negative impact on one's well-being. And when people spoke of experiencing high levels of well-being, they would often talk about eating healthy, getting a lot of exercise and quality sleep. So essentially are part of our lifestyle behaviors. Stress and resilience is also depicted here, as well as emotional and mental health, along with others listed in the top 10, such as having a purpose and meaning, sense of self, financial security, our spirituality or religiosity, and maybe surprising is creativity. So even when you draw on your mind back to the PERMA approach, you see how well that segments into where we believe the importance is around our health and well-being. And this brings me to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration dimensions of well-being. And some of you might be familiar with different dimensions of well-being being less. This one has 8, and this is one I use very often in the curriculum that I'm involved in for students, residents, faculty, and staff. So every aspect of wellness can affect a person's life, and working toward all of them one way or another is a great goal because wellness relates directly to the quality of a person's life. So it has many dimensions in our lives, including emotional, physical, occupational, intellectual, financial, social, environmental, and spiritual. So again, drawing back to the research, it clearly is represented here, and all are interconnected and build on one another. So creating balance in our lives, it is such an important part of our wellness, and overall, a balanced life can mean many things depending on your culture or circumstance, resources, and other factors. Balance means making sure we have time to do the things that make us feel happier and can lead to professional growth as well. So, how do we shift the paradigm, given present circumstances, towards more happiness and positive emotions? Some of you may be well familiar with Sonia Lyubomirsky's work, but if not, I do encourage you to read The How of Happiness. She and her collaborator were given more than $1 million by the National Institutes of Mental Health to study and find out what makes happy people happy and how to raise the happiness of the general population. Her research tells us the fountain of happiness can be found in how we behave, what we think, and what goals we set every day of our lives. So essentially, there is no happiness without action. It may surprise some of you to know that our life circumstances do not significantly impact our happiness. 50% of our happiness is determined by our genetics. So that's what you can consider your happiness set point. 10% life circumstance, as I mentioned, but we have the power, which is so important, to change the 40% that comes from intentional day-to-day activities that promotes more happiness in life. And what do we know some of that to be? Well, that's what's listed here. Happier people tend to nurture social relationships, have an attitude of gratitude, are the first to help others, so compassion and action, practice active optimism, Savor the pleasures in life to be more in the present moment. So savoring experience over things. Make physical activity a habit. Are committed to meaningful goals or a purpose. And often are spiritual or religious. So this brings me to thinking about what can get in the way of our happiness, of helping us reduce our stress, calming our nervous systems, being able to be in better balance, and having more resiliency, promoting skill development. And that, my friends, comes to what's going on up here. Our number one bad habit is our thoughts. So the things that we are thinking. And part of that relates to how we've been hardwired as humans. Our ancestry has been wired, and this transcends to us, to scan our environment for bad things, for danger, for your nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system to kick in and help save us from something detrimental. So we're wired for this. We're scanning our environment all times for the negative. And part of that negativity is what's going on up here in the thoughts that we have in our mind. And I love this quote by Rick Hansen. Another book recommendation here is called Resilient. I've used this as well quite a bit in my teachings. And he says this: our brains are like Velcro for bad experiences, but Teflon for good ones. So how many times in your life have you had let's say you took an exam from back in your education and training? Do you remember all the things you performed well on? Or do you remember that one question you missed? Or when you've had competency assessments and feedback given constructively, do you focus more on all of the praises and strengths to retain? Or does your mind go to the constructive critique? I dare say it's to the latter, which shows an opportunity for us to shift the dimension and change our thinking. And this little guy over here, Mr. Ant, represents our automatic negative thoughts. So the things that we may be totally unaware of that we think, and how that influences our emotions and our attitude and our mindset. Part of what can happen in ant-related thinking are things such as this. Maybe there are situations that you personalize. Maybe you blame yourself when things go wrong. Maybe you are polarizing. So it's sort of a black and white, no shades of gray. Something is good or bad. Nothing in the middle in your perception or your read or take on a situation. And then we have magnification, only focusing on the bad. That's a prime example of what I was just sharing moments ago. Or perhaps catastrophizing, where you might always just expect the worst. And perhaps this can impact us in our mindset, being fixed versus open, pessimistic versus optimistic. The importance here, as I alluded to earlier in this webinar, is that we have an opportunity through techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy and strategies like mindfulness practices. And here you're seeing an example of the power of meditation, that we can create space between the stimulus that creates the thought and what we in fact then do with those thoughts as a means to correct our response or our thinking moving forward. And part of that relates to our emotions, right? So this is a technique that some of you may be familiar with. I wanted to definitely share. And this comes from the work of Professor Dan Siegel, another well-known researcher in positive psychology, around name it to tame it. So naming our emotions in order to tame them and then generate more positivity. So if you can define something that bothers you, so a fear, an anxiety, maybe it's a bad habit that you want to focus on, you might be able to overcome some of that challenge or roadblock by taking an opportunity to use techniques like this to sort of name it and then work towards shifting this dimension around mindset and thought process. You might ask yourself some questions like, what does this problem present to me? What does this thought or emotion present to me? Does this emotion come frequently and rise up quite often in my mindset? Is it touching multiple areas of my life or impacting my relationships with colleagues? Have there been times in the past that I can draw from to sort of overcome what I may be feeling or thinking about a certain circumstance or a certain situation? This is an example of additional thought-provoking reflective questions you might scan at with me to think about as it relates to you as an individual or in relationships with colleagues. So sort of coming to that team dynamics here. Asking yourself these questions, taking time to reflect, to think more metacognitively about your thoughts and emotions so that you can better understand them and appreciate what may be going on to make some course corrections. Another important aspect that I think is very relational to what I'm discussing, and some of you may be very well familiar with this as well, but still important to mention, is our locus of control. So in life, our locus of control refers to the degree to which an individual will feel a sense of agency in regard to your life, so to his or her life. And the outer circle depicted here represents things we can't control. And that is different for each of us and how we perceive this in life. But an example might be related to the pandemic. And originally, we really didn't have any control about what would happen with vaccine development or how effective the vaccine would have been for us. That's an area we can't control. And then we have the middle circle, which are things we have influence over, but we can't necessarily control it. So an example might be whether or not we can prevent the spread with the vaccine. We can do something to participate in that by getting vaccinated, by frequently having good hand hygiene, by masking and taking proper precautions, which we know has significantly decreased the incidence of flu, not COVID, but the flu, just from what we've been doing with hand hygiene and mask wearing. So we have an opportunity to influence that. We can participate in that. And then the inner circle is where you have the control. And so what it is that you do on your part. Again, this example might relate to things like our hand hygiene. But what's important here strategically is to pause. And when we face situations in life, when we are trying to build up our positivity, is to realize where we have control and where we don't. And where you don't, or where you have influence, you do your part to influence it, knowing you might not be able to change the outcome. Can you be okay and reconcile that? When you can have control, can you let it go? I know that is not like a light switch, but can you work towards the ability to kind of release and let be? And spend your time in this inner circle, or when you look over here to this other picture on your right, which hopefully you can see some of, these are prime examples that we have control over, with some others here around the circle that we don't. So it's important to utilize this as a strategy as well to help us release the things that cause us negative emotions or negativity in life and those stresses in life. So I invite you as one post action item from today. If you hadn't had a chance to do the survey, that's certainly one. This is also another opportunity to maybe take these questions and use them also as another reflection tool. Thinking about your negative thoughts that you might have, if that's something you're aware of. What language do you use with yourself when you notice you make a mistake or there might be a flaw? As you go about your day, can you notice if you're using any harsh or unkind language with yourself? And maybe that's transcending to others, to perhaps colleagues, because of a mindset. Can you flip to be more compassionate? How can you reframe your language to be more kind and supportive? Self-compassion starts here, inward. So think about maybe this is another tool that you can utilize, and you're welcome to share with others if you believe it would be beneficial. So that brings me to another positive psychology kind of If you remember, those signs I had were sort of coming on the highway here up to the sign around the power of gratitude, which I consider to be a therapeutic superpower. So it, in fact, is another emotion we can draw from the well to lead to more positive thinking and positive emotions. Robert Emmons, you probably know, is associated with this research. He's a psychology professor and gratitude researcher at the University of California, Davis. And he explains there are two main components of gratitude. First, we affirm the good things we've received. And second, we acknowledge the role other people play in enriching our lives. Grateful people are more resilient. There's a number of studies showing that in the face of serious trauma, adversity, and suffering, if people have a grateful disposition, they recover more quickly. Gratitude can change our perspective of how we interpret negative life events and help guard against post-traumatic stress or anxiety. Grateful people also have higher sense of self-worth and positivity. When you're grateful, you sense that someone else is looking out for you. Someone else has provided for your well-being, or you notice a network of relationships, both past and present, of people who are responsible for helping you get to where you are right now. And once you start to recognize the contributions that other people have, what they've made in your life, once you realize that other people see value in you, you transform the way you see yourself. Gratitude allows us to celebrate the present, magnifying our positive emotions. It's an affirmation of goodness in life. We affirm that there are good things in the world, gifts and benefits we receive. This doesn't mean we believe life is perfect. It doesn't ignore complaints, burdens, or hassles. But when we look at our life as a whole, gratitude encourages us to identify some amount of goodness in life. It helps us recognize the sources of goodness as being outside of ourselves. It didn't stem from anything we necessarily did ourselves. We appreciate those positive traits that are in yourself, and true gratitude involves a humble dependence on others. But gratitude is associated with brain benefits. It helps boost our good feeling hormones. It's a mood enhancer, so we can feel more joy and pleasure through our neurochemicals like serotonin and oxytocin. Our immune system is strengthened. It leads to softening of feelings towards others and self. And it becomes this inner reservoir of strength, an antidote to fear and worry, and better sleep quality, which is also wonderful and super important. The next road sign I wanted to briefly touch on today is forgiveness. And forgiveness can be initiated by different means, and it can be a result of changes in our thinking, perhaps an offender's behavior, maybe the victim's behavior, emotional experiences and expression. Maybe it's related to spiritual experiences and expression. It can be any combination of this. Some of us may be innately more forgiving than others, and forgiveness can be conceptualized as a personality trait or as an aspect of more complex, enduring quality like resilience, as we've been speaking about. There was a meta-analysis done by Worthington and Meyer and Wade, and they identified 3 elements that were common among all effective forgiveness interventions, irrespective of what interventional model or what theory the methods related back to. The use of multiple methods to reduce unforgiveness, so that's 1. Committing to forgiveness is 2nd. And then empathizing, or experiencing positivity, other-oriented emotions as an antidote to being unforgiving. So one model of forgiveness that I tend to draw back to is listed here, depicted on the right side of the slide, in a companion to one of my favorite quotes, which is, "To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that prisoner was you." So it's one of my favorite quotes. And this mnemonic here to your right might be helpful if we start to anchor and think back to reach. how to reach for forgiveness. So R is to recall the hurt. E is to empathize with the person who hurt you. A is to give an altruistic gift of forgiveness. Commit to the emotional forgiveness that was experienced, and then holding on to forgiveness when doubt should arise. So definitely the power of forgiveness is equally important as an attitude of gratitude. So I also think as it relates to team dynamics, thinking about forgiveness, gratitude, positive emotions, this is a series of questions you don't necessarily need to answer now, but another reflection corner opportunity, both as yourself as the individual and your relationships with colleagues, to think about what might be at play in the importance of those challenges, those conflicts that might arise that would lend itself to more of a courageous conversation. And so think about utilizing this to sort of check in as to what may be occurring amongst colleagues in thinking about ways to bring more gratitude and more perhaps forgiveness in those relationships. There are also some really great practices that can be put into place for yourself and also beneficial to teams. Those are listed here. The latter list I'm going to touch on a little bit more specifically next. But Jolt of Joy is essentially using an opportunity to keep close to you, to your person, or to a team, the things that bring you joy, the things that cause you to feel heartfelt emotions and positivity. Maybe it's a comic, it's a picture, it's a song. I love music, it's so powerful. Maybe it's poetry. Maybe it's a person who just always can make you laugh. What will help relax you, center you, and ground you? Can you keep that available to use as a resource when you need it the most? Practicing kindness comes right back to gratitude, even when you expect nothing in return. This can be very powerful as it relates to ourselves and our relationships. Having an act of service that you can do on behalf of another, especially when you know them well enough, they may not be inclined as to ask, that you volunteer of your time, gift, and talent to them. I'm going to talk about creating safe spaces in a minute. Ways to short circuit your stress. I think each of these has an opportunity to do that. So this is a safe space technique you might want to consider adopting. It works great for team dynamics. And I've done this many times at faculty meetings, is to sort of go around the table or the virtual table of late and ask people to share a rose and a thorn, or maybe a bud, a rose, a bud, and a thorn. A rose is what is something really good and positive that has happened in your life. That could be work or not work related. Maybe something is a bud that's blossoming to become a rose that they're very excited about, energized around. And then a thorn would be something they're struggling with as a means to relate to one another, to maybe have a safe conversation about what might not be going well and how to come around one another as it relates to teams to support one another through those difficulties. So that's one technique I wanted to share. As I lead into a very quick review around the importance of discernment when it comes to emotions and supporting one another between sympathy, empathy, and compassion. So emotion researchers generally define empathy as the ability to sense other people's emotions, coupled with the ability to imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling. And studies suggest that empathy is often a vital first step towards altruistic behavior. It may not always lead to altruistic acts, but it often does. Research by Daniel Batson and others suggests that empathy is much more likely to lead to altruism when it elicits a specific feeling of concern. So again, this is when we observe someone in need and truly feel for that person. It's very similar to compassion. When we feel compassion, this is when we're moved to actually act on the behalf of someone else. Whereas sympathy means more of sort of feeling together, or it's sometimes synonymously used with compassion, but sympathy does. However, while sympathy does refer to feelings of sorrow or sadness about another's suffering, it does not typically involve the urge or motivation to help. So that can be sort of that discerning difference of being moved to act, feeling versus action. This is a great tool I also wanted to share that can impact outcomes if we pause and think before we speak. So this think approach is defined as such. Your T is, how do I know what I'm about to read, share, or say is true? So is it true? What criteria might be useful to understand before you speak? H, what will make my information and the way I share it helpful? How can I create more of an authentic filter and a more compassionate response when you're speaking out to others? What ideas might I share that are more inspiring to other individuals? What ingredients are necessary to engage with more of an open mind? Am I more aware of my self biases, my implicit bias? How can I show kindness in the moment? So just a tool like this can be so powerful, used before we speak, especially in circumstances where you are emotionally charged or you're involved in colleagues in a situation where they need you to involve yourself as an administrator, perhaps, and the situation is emotionally charged. And that brings me to briefly mentioning the importance of emotional intelligence. And it's essentially the ability to recognize and reason about our own emotions as well as other emotions. And Daniel Goleman is very well known. You may be familiar with his book, Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. So he lays out these components of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-regulation, or self-management, as you're seeing here, empathy, which I've mentioned, and social skills. So self-awareness has two parts, both emotional and social. Emotional self-awareness is recognizing your own strengths, weaknesses, maybe your personality traits and communication styles. Social self-awareness, on the other hand, involves knowing how people see you, which can be trickier for us to recognize. Good self-regulation involves controlling our impulses to make sure we're acting appropriately for situations as they present themselves to us. Empathy, again, I've already covered this. And then social skills are particularly important during those crucial conversations. So before we might give constructive criticism, can we explain how we might be sharing our thoughts? Because we don't want to come across in a judgment position or a blaming position. So that might help the other person be more receptive and open to the constructive critique and not feeling offended when we give feedback. So this brings me to a point as a great bridge, because thinking about emotional intelligence is a great segue towards positive relationships with our loved ones and with our colleagues. So when we meet up in our next session, this will be a conduit for me to continue around the power of positive relationships. So before I open for questions in the remaining time we have, I want to end with this food for thought. And it's called Life is a Camera. Life is like a camera. Just focus on what's important. Capture the good times. Develop from the negatives. And if things don't turn out, just take another shot. And then if you're curious, and if you happen to be a fan, or maybe you haven't heard from him, Jason Mraz is one of my favorite artists, and he has a song called 3 Things. So if you have some time today and you're curious, you can easily find that on the internet, and I encourage you to play it and see how your emotions take shape to become more positive based on his lyrics and this music. Last thing I'm going to mention before I check in with you on questions and how you're feeling is my husband and I happen to author a newsletter rooted in positive psychology as pharmacists, and we call it the Wellbeing Elixir because I'm a pharmacist. And if you're curious, you can scan this QR code. It's totally available, open source to anyone who's interested to sign up and receive that. I wrote a particular one all around the ants and how to be an ant eater. And he's authored one that I think is relevant in terms of positive emotions as well, called Becoming Your Best Self. So maybe you want to check those out. You're welcome to scan that if that's of interest. And I'll come back to that in a minute for you. But I do want to check in. How y'all feeling? How's your energy? Hopefully I haven't worn you out and depleted you with too much information, but how are we doing? How are you feeling? You can throw it in the chat. Awesome. So that brings me to the end of the presentation, knowing that it is really just the beginning because I have 4 more opportunities to come back with y'all and visit again about these other critical aspects of positive psychology and the PERMA approach. So I'm going to put the newsletter back up just in case you're interested. And I welcome any questions before we close out our time together. You're welcome to put something in the chat, or if you want to step up to the mic and unmute yourself, you're welcome to share a comment or question if you should have one.
And Tina, this is Alexa. I did put the registration link for part 2 in the chat. So everyone feel free to click on that to register. And the full registration information can be found on the NAP website under the calendar for each part of the series.
And I'll be sure to provide a handout version from the slides today as well in case folks are interested. Oh, you're so welcome. Well, if there are no questions, I'm okay to wait a few more minutes if someone wants to hang around and ask me something. But otherwise, I want to be mindful of your day and actually maybe give you that 5-minute opportunity to move away from your desk and stretch your legs, take a deep inhalation, exhalation to continue to greet the rest of your day. And thank you so much for joining.
All right. Thank you so much, Tina.
You're welcome. See you all next time.
All right. We'll see you then.
Bye.